On the night Valentina Bellarosa was supposed to announce her engagement, Lake Como looked like a sheet of black glass under a silver moon. The villa terraces glowed with candles, violins drifted through the warm air, and every powerful family from Milan to Lugano had gathered to watch her become someone else's future. She stood at the top of the marble staircase in a dress the color of champagne. One hand on the banister, the other wrapped around her father's old signet ring hidden in her palm. And from where she stood, she could see her fiancé below, smiling for the guests, one arm around her stepmother. The same stepmother who had promised to love her after her father died. The same fiancé who had whispered an hour earlier that tonight would change everything. Bellarosa had believed he meant marriage, then she heard him say, in a low, careless voice he never expected her to hear, once she signs after the announcement. The Bellarosa shares transfer to me, and after that, Layla can send her anywhere she wants. The blood left Bellarosa's face so fast she had to grip the banister to keep from falling. Her stepmother laughed softly, raised her wine glass and said, a grieving daughter is difficult, a sedated wife is easier. Downstairs the guests applauded because somebody thought a toast had ended. Upstairs Bellarosa stopped breathing. Then the villa lights went out. The music snapped off. A woman screamed near the garden, and when the chandeliers flickered back to life 20 seconds later, Bellarosa's fiancé was on his knees beside the body of her family lawyer, his hands covered in blood. And before Bellarosa could move, he lifted his head, pointed straight at the staircase, and shouted. She was arguing with him. She killed him. 100 faces turned upward together. The lake wind pushed cold through the open terrace doors. Bellarosa looked down at a hall full of strangers, all eyes and enemies, and understood in one sharp, merciless second that if she stayed where she was, they would bury her before dawn. She ran. Not down the stairs but through the dark back corridor behind the portrait gallery. Her heels in one hand, dress gathered in the other. Heart slamming against her ribs. Behind her came voices, then footsteps. Then men calling her name in that fake soothing tone people use when they are planning to ruin you gently. Bellarosa knew the old villa better than any of them because she had grown up there every summer. She cut through the blue salon, through the half-open conservatory, through the stone arch near the kitchens and out into the moonlit gardens where cypress shadows stretched long over the grass. She made it as far as the cliff path above the private dock before a man stepped out of the dark and blocked her way. Tall, broad-shouldered, black suit, no tie. Rain in his hair though the sky was clear. His face was known in half the country and feared in all of it, Luca Vascelli. The man newspapers called a shipping magnate and judges called a problem. The man her father had forbidden from ever entering the villa. The man every whispered story eventually reached if it was dark enough. Bellarosa jerked backward, ready to run the other way. But he said only, if you go back, they will hand you to the police. If you stay here, they will shoot you and call it panic. If you want to live, get in the boat. Below them the private dock rocked in the water. A black launch waited with its engine running low. Bellarosa stared at him. Why would you help me? Luca's eyes held hers. Steady, unreadable, dangerous. Because your father asked me to. 2 years ago, the day before he died. She laughed once in disbelief. My father hated you. Your father hated many things. That did not stop him from being practical. Behind them voices drew closer, flashlights moved through the garden. Luca stepped nearer and lowered his voice. You can hate me after sunrise, Bellarosa. Right now you need to decide whether you want revenge or a grave. Then a shot cracked through the night and shattered the stone lantern beside her head. Luca caught her by the waist and pulled her down the steps as marble dust rained around them. 2 seconds later they were in the boat, Lake Como opening wide and black before them. The villa shrinking behind them like a jeweled trap. He took her not to Milan, not to the police, but to an old monastery turned fortress above Bellagio. A place of iron gates, lemon trees, and impossible silence. By dawn Bellarosa stood in a borrowed white shirt at a window overlooking the lake. Exhausted, furious, and still not certain she had not stepped out of one nightmare into another. Luca poured coffee as if nothing about the night had been unusual, when he turned and handed her a cup. She saw the scar along his jaw more clearly, pale and old. "You have until I finish this coffee to explain why my father would trust you with anything." Luca set a leather folder on the table. Inside was a copy of her father's will, one she had never seen. And beneath it a letter in her father's handwriting. Bellarosa read the first line and all the strength went out of her knees. "If anything happens to me, do not trust Layla, do not trust Samir. Do not sign anything. And if Luca Vascelli comes for you, go with him until you understand why." Bellarosa sat down hard, the room turning slow and distant around her. Samir was her fiancé, Layla her stepmother. These were not vague suspicions or late fears. Her father had known. Luca watched her without pity. "Your father discovered that the Bellarosa shipping network was being sold in pieces through charity fronts, shell ports, and museum foundations. He was preparing to stop it." Bellarosa looked up. "Stop by who?" Luca's jaw hardened. "By the people smiling in your house last night. And by one name your father would not write twice. Arturo Bellarosa." Bellarosa went still. Arturo Bellarosa was her uncle, her father's older brother. The man who had wept at the funeral, kissed her forehead, and promised to protect the family legacy. "No," she whispered. Luca leaned on the table. "He wanted control of every route from Como to Marseille. Your father stood in the way. Then your father died in a car crash, and suddenly Layla married into mourning. Samir appeared with perfect timing. And your lawyer bled on the floor before the transfer papers could disappear." Bellarosa's hands started shaking then. Not from fear but from the force of understanding. Too many moments in the last 2 years rearranged themselves at once. The pressure to return to the villa, the gentle insistence that grief had made her unstable. The growing obsession with paperwork. Inheritance, signatures, appearances. "Why do you care?" she asked. Luca looked at the lake for a long moment before answering. "Because my sister was murdered on one of your family's routes 3 years ago. And the man who gave the order still drinks on your terrace?" The air between them changed after that, not softer, not safer. Just honest in a way the rest of her life had not been. The days that followed were made of coded ledgers. Whispered names, ferry crossings at dawn, and long drives along mountain roads where the lake kept appearing below them like a witness. Bellarosa learned that her father had hidden proof inside the restoration plans for the family villas. Tiny architectural notes that were not notes at all, but coordinates, account chains, dates of transfers. Names linked to disguised art shipments that were really weapons and girls and cash. Luca moved through that world with frightening ease. Guards stepped aside for him. Bankers went pale at the sound of his name. Priests opened locked rooms. And yet with her he was careful in ways that unsettled her more than violence would have. He never touched her without warning. Never entered a room she had locked. Never told her to trust him. He only said, again and again, "Look at the facts, then decide." On the third night, he took her to an abandoned boathouse on the western shore, where her father had once hidden summer furniture. Inside, waiting in the dust and blue light, was her cousin Miriam, the cousin everyone believed had moved to Canada after a nervous breakdown. Bellarosa crossed the room in disbelief. "Miriam." Miriam began crying before Bellarosa reached her. "I tried to warn your father," Arturo found out. "They said they would put me in a clinic if I spoke again." Piece by piece, shaking and ashamed, Miriam told them everything. Arturo had spent years stripping the Bellarosa network clean. Layla had debts before marrying Bellarosa's father. Samir had been recruited through those debts. Not to love Bellarosa but to marry her, gain legal control of her voting shares. Then have her declared unfit after the wedding. The murdered lawyer had changed sides at the last minute and planned to tell Bellarosa the truth on the night of the engagement. Announcement. That was why he died before the dessert course. Bellarosa listened without blinking. Something inside her freezing into clarity. When Miriam finished, the room went quiet except for the water against the posts below. Luca asked softly, "Do you want out?" Bellarosa looked up at him. "Out. I can put you on a plane. Erase your trail." Give you a new name and enough money to vanish anywhere. She laughed then, low and sharp. They kill my father. Steal my life. Try to drug me into a marriage. Frame me for murder. And you think I want a beach in another country? For the first time his mouth almost smiled. I wanted to hear you say it. Bellarosa stepped closer. Anger burning clean through her. I do not want to escape Luca. I want them to stand in daylight and understand exactly who destroyed them. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth, then rose again. Darker now. Good. Because I am tired of burying people in the dark for crimes that deserve witnesses. Their plan began at the one place Arturo trusted most, beauty. He was hosting a restoration gala at Villa Carlotta 5 nights later. A charity event for maritime heritage, cameras, donors, politicians. And every relevant newspaper on the lake. Layla would appear in widow black diamonds and Samir in polished disgrace. Publicly heartbroken by Bellarosa's disappearance. Privately waiting for her body to be found or her signature to be forged. Luca wanted to destroy the accounts first and the people second. Bellarosa wanted them to feel it happening. The compromise they forged together was brutal and elegant. They would give Arturo the evening he had paid for, then take the floor away beneath it. Between planning meetings and false invitations, something dangerous and tender started breathing between them. It was there in the silences. In the way Luca stood too near when passing her a file and then stepped back as if fighting himself. In the way Bellarosa caught him watching her when he thought she was asleep over ledgers. In the way he once took a shard of broken glass from her hand and held her wrist for 1 beat longer than necessary. His thumb resting over her pulse like he was shocked it answered to him. The night before the gala rain struck the monastery windows and the power went out for half an hour. They stood in candlelight over a map of the villa, shadows moving across old stone. Bellarosa looked up and found him watching her with something far too human in his face. Say it, she whispered. He did not pretend not to understand. If this ends badly, I will regret many things. That is not what I asked. Thunder rolled over the lake. Luca's voice dropped, rough and restrained. I have wanted to kiss you since the night I pulled you into that boat. I did not because you were drowning. Then because you were grieving. Then because you were angry. And now, because if I do it tonight, you may mistake desire for safety, and I will not steal one more choice from your life. Bellarosa felt the truth of that all the way to her bones. She stepped closer until only breath remained between them. Then let me choose. When he kissed her, it was not gentle and it was not careless. It was the kiss of a man who had denied himself too long, and a woman who had spent a week, walking out of one life and into another with her eyes open. When it ended, they stayed forehead to forehead, both breathing hard, both aware that tomorrow could ruin everything. Luca said, almost like a vow, if you tell me to walk away after this is over, I will, Bellarosa answered. Then do not waste tonight apologizing for what has not happened yet. The gala blazed with light. White orchids lined the stairs. String music floated through manicured gardens. And Lake Como shone beyond the terraces like polished steel. Arturo welcomed ministers and investors, with the smile of a man who had never buried a brother with one hand and forged his name with the other. Layla wore emeralds Bellarosa remembered from her mother's jewelry case. Samir stood at her side in a midnight tuxedo, handsome enough to be forgiven by anyone who had not heard him bargaining over her future. When Bellarosa appeared at the top of the grand staircase, the room lost its breath. No one had seen her for 5 days. Every paper in Milan called her unstable, missing, dangerous. Now she stood alive and composed in a fitted ivory gown with no diamonds. No fear, and Luca Vascelli beside her like a threat made flesh. Somebody dropped a glass. Arturo's smile died first. Then Leela's Samir recovered fastest. He took one step forward and pitched his voice into public concern. Bellarosa, thank God, where have you been? She came down the stairs slowly, every camera rising with her. Learning, she said, and walked past him to the center of the ballroom where the charity presentation screen waited behind the podium. Arturo found his voice, warm and paternal. My dear girl. Everyone has been worried. Perhaps this is not the moment. Bellarosa turned to face the guests. No, uncle, this is exactly the moment. With a small nod from Luca, the screen behind her lit up. Not with donation figures but with transfer records. Notarized copies, maritime manifests, surveillance stills, voice recordings. And her father's final statement. The ballroom changed temperature in seconds. Whispers spread like sparks. Arturo lunged toward the technician booth only to find Luca's men already there. Silent and immovable, Bellarosa's voice carried clear across marble and crystal. 3 years ago my father discovered that Bellarosa charity routes were being used to move illegal cargo and launder money through heritage foundations. He planned to expose it. Instead he died. Since then my stepmother, my uncle, and the man I was expected to marry have worked together to steal control of the company. Drug me into compliance, and frame me for murder when the family lawyer chose conscience over fear. Layla went white. You are sick. Bellarosa did not even look at her. No, Layla. I was sick when I believed you. Samir tried a different tactic. Heartbreak for the cameras. I loved you. Bellarosa finally turned to him, and whatever was in her eyes made him stop where he stood. No, you loved what my signature could unlock. Then Arturo did what powerful old men do when charm fails. He reached for rage. You ungrateful child. Everything in your life came from this family. Bellarosa smiled, small and lethal. Then it will satisfy you to know I am returning the favor. She pressed one key on the remote in her hand. The final files opened, including the recording Arturo thought no one possessed, his own voice, drunk and careless. Confirming that Bellarosa's father would never get in the way again once the breaks were arranged. The ballroom exploded. Donors backed away. Phones lifted. Reporters began shouting questions. Samir grabbed Bellarosa's wrist in blind panic. Turn it off. Before she could move, Luca was there. Removing Samir's hand with frightening calm. You should leave before I remember all the reasons I dislike you. Police entered from the terrace doors then. Not local police bought by family friendship, but federal financial investigators with warrants and armed support. Arturo's face collapsed into something old and terrified. Layla tried to run. Miriam stepped out from the side gallery and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, do not let her cry. She only does that when witnesses are present. Even then it was not finished, because men like Arturo never go quietly. He pulled a small pistol from inside his jacket and aimed not at Bellarosa but at Luca. Perhaps because hatred is simplest where fear is purest. The shot cracked through the ballroom. Luca moved. Bellarosa moved faster. She seized a bronze candlestick from the podium and swung with all the force of grief and fury in 5 stolen years. The blow smashed Arturo's wrist. The gun flew across the floor. Guests screamed. Police swarmed, and Arturo Bellarosa, Lord of terraces and charities and lies, went down on his knees clutching his ruined hand while cameras flashed like lightning. When the sirens faded and the last statement was taken, dawn was beginning to pale the sky over the lake. Villa Carlotta stood wrecked by truth. Flowers trampled, glasses broken, reputations burning. Samir had been led away in silence, unable to meet Bellarosa's eyes. Layla had cursed everyone until the car door shut on her voice. Arturo had not stopped shouting that everything belonged to him. Mariam sat wrapped in a police blanket on the terrace steps, laughing and crying at once like a woman waking from a long poisoned sleep. Bellarosa walked out to the far balustrade where the garden fell away toward the water. She felt empty for a moment, then light, then suddenly devastated. Not because she regretted what she had done, but because justice never returns the dead. Behind her footsteps approached and stopped. Luca. She did not turn immediately. She spoke to the lake first. I thought revenge would feel louder. His answer came low and close. Real revenge is quiet. It is the sound of a locked door opening and never having to beg again. She laughed softly through the tears that had finally come. Then he stood beside her, jacket off, blood at his cuff where glass had cut him in the chaos. Bellarosa took his hand before she could overthink it. Their fingers closed naturally, as if the last week had been teaching them that shape all along. My father knew, she said. Not everything, but enough. He left the final proof hidden in the one place Arturo never looked. My restoration notes. He trusted that if I survived, I would read them properly. Luca looked at her. Something unguarded moving across his face. He knew who you were before you did. Bellarosa breathed in the cold blue morning. And who am I? His thumb brushed across her knuckles. A woman nobody gets to write over again. 3 months later, the Bellarosa roots were under investigation. The legitimate company had been restructured. Miriam ran the Cultural Foundation honestly for the first time in its history. Bellarosa spent her mornings at the lakeside offices, rebuilding contracts, and her afternoons restoring an abandoned villa her father once loved. Not because she needed a monument, but because saving something without lying to it had become its own kind of healing. The papers kept trying to name her heiress, scandal bride, avenging daughter, survivor. She ignored them all. One warm evening at the end of summer, as the water turned gold and ferries cut slow white lines across the lake, she found Luca waiting on the half-repaired terrace with 2 coffees and the expression of a man trying not to appear hopeful. You are on my property without permission, she said. He handed her a cup. I was told the owner occasionally forgives trespassing if coffee is excellent. She sipped, considered, and nodded once. Reasonable policy. They stood side by side, looking out over Lake Como. Below them, the lights were beginning to wake along the shore. Behind them, the restored windows caught the sunset. Luca spoke first, careful as ever when it came to her freedom. I can still leave if what happened between us belonged only to a war. Bellarosa turned to him then, to the dangerous man who had pulled her from a trap, given her facts instead of lies, desire instead of ownership, and space instead of chains. If it belonged only to a war, she said softly, I would not be thinking about you on peaceful days. Something in him loosened at last, not weakness, never that, just relief. Pure and rare. Bellarosa set her coffee aside, stepped into him, and kissed him slowly this time. Not in candlelight before battle, but in the clear open evening after truth, when they finally parted. Luca rested his forehead against hers and asked, almost like he could still be denied, what happens now? Bellarosa smiled, the lake breeze lifting her hair, the whole wide shimmering water at her back. Now, she said, you take me to dinner in Bellagio, somewhere public. Somewhere with terrible pasta and too many tourists. And after that, we see what kind of life 2 honest monsters can build. Luca laughed, low and disbelieving. Then offered her his hand. Bellarosa took it. And together they walked down the terrace steps toward the waiting lights. Not as savior and victim, not as debt and payment, not as names trapped in old family wars, but as 2 people moving toward something neither had bought, stolen, or forced. And below them, Lake Como glittered in the falling dusk like a promise finally spoken in its own true voice.